Hello everyone. Now we are coming to an end to the second module of the course on moral thinking. Uh, Today we'll take a fleshed out lived example of what we mean by or where ethical concepts are implemented and how we can alter the meaning of an ethical notion or how a paradigm has a particular notion. So, this particularly starts from the notion of egoism and altruism. Now, egoism is something that we have talked about earlier, and in egoism we've talked about the paradox of egoism, that how egoism tries to be a catch-all theory. We haven't talked about altruism. Now, altruism is an example of where we find the agent or the person needs to sacrifice oneself for the good of others and gains advantage or gains joy or gains satisfaction in this activity of sacrificing oneself. So, altruism is something which has been very frequently celebrated as a venerable quality, right? Now, till now we've been talking about various theories, and I would perpetually like to address the skeptic in all of us, in you particularly, who would be questioning that what is the point of these theories, where does it touch the world out there? And that's quite a valid question that if you are having, as what is it that makes these moral theories, concepts that we talk about, how does it change the world, how does it affect the world? Today's text chosen is an example of such is an example that answers this particular skeptical query that one can have, that how do the moral concepts matter, how do they change the world that we live in. Now, many of you may have heard of Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand is an author, is a philosopher, and this book is probably in the 1960s, 1965, if I remember correctly. Ayn Rand is a very famous literature. She's written books like The Fountainhead, books that have defined a generation, right? That have defined a generation, and let me hit the nail on the head, has laid the foundation of capitalism as a theory. So, here we find that Ayn Rand is essentially a storyteller. She is telling the story of she is making stories. She's newly migrated to the United States of America from the erstwhile USSR, and you can get an idea of the kind of environment she's coming from, a very controlled economy, a very paternalistic nation state to a freer nation state. There's a migration there that takes place. Now, she puts out, writes novels, stories. Fountainhead is one of them, Atlas Shrugged. Many of you may have read it, those of you haven't read it. Let me briefly tell you what is the philosophy that she advocates through it. And here we come to see the connection between literature and philosophy, right? Very often when we find that there is a literature that encapsulates philosophy, as I would like to put forth that literature is the vehicle of philosophy, right? So, literature is the vehicle of philosophy. Okay. Now, let me put this back into perspective. So, when you watch a movie, or when you watch a movie that has the power to change the way you perceive world or live your life or be inspired, it generally has a story, but the story has a philosophy that has been fleshed out in the form of a story. Ayn Rand does exactly that, and that too at a massive scale. Ayn Rand has argued for the capitalist spirit, for the capitalist philosophy, championing freedom, not equality, championing freedom to the individual as the foundation of any good world order. So, well, look at the intimidating title she chooses. Now, this particular, the text that you are referring to here is a book called Ayn Rand's The Virtue of Selfishness, 1965, and this is published by various publishers. You can choose any publisher. In that, the first chapter is the objectivist ethics. So, this particular book is not in the form of a story, but this articulates the philosophy that her novels have been talking about. And here is where you see how philosophy connects to the world. She has inspired a whole generation of entrepreneurs, of capitalists, of a world order where capitalism is celebrated and not seen as, in many quarters, capitalism was seen as something evil or wicked or inhuman. And that is why look at the intimidating title that she starts with, called The Virtue of Selfishness. So, what do we when we talk about the virtue of selfishness? It seems contrary, right? That selfishness is something very bad, and altruism talks about selflessness, and therefore selflessness is being selfless is a good thing, and being selfish is a bad thing. These are preliminary notions that we come with, and that is what the author is trying to challenge, and she is trying to find the virtue of selfishness. So, this is a philosophical exercise here, in particularly in this particular chapter of this book, Virtue of Selfishness, called the first chapter called The Objectivist Ethics. She articulates what she means by the why she holds selfishness as a virtue. Now, what is and here what does she do? She starts by giving a new concept of egoism, right? She looks at the history of morality. She looks at, let me give a perspective, and what would okay, the way you should go about this particular lecture is, you should first go and first listen to this lecture. That will give you a brief overview of what this particular chapter is talking about. Then visit this particular chapter in the text and read that thoroughly, and then in a discussion hour, or then revisit this lecture, or in a discussion hour we can discuss the same. So, what Ayn Rand is doing, she is giving a new concept of egoism, the history of morality or of mankind's ethics. Let me just read out the screen, and then we can discuss it point by point. History of morality of mankind's ethics has been of more harm than use. Ethics has been objective necessity vis-a-vis ethics as objective or necessary versus subjective or luxury. What makes values possible? That's a fundamental question that she talks about. Morality, is there anything rational, irrational about it? And what are the sources of morality, and the indestructibility and morality argument, right? So, now coming to the first point, well, she takes a look at the history of morality, and then she asks the question that, well, what has been the history of morality? It has caused us more harm than benefit. It has ascribed certain acts as good, certain acts as bad, very often whimsically, very often based on someone's whims, and thereby has actually caused more harm than good. So, we are typically talking of, say, witch burning societies, or societies where superstition prevailed, where the notion of right and wrong almost was a license to kill, and it continues till date. So, she looks at ethics and questions whether that has actually caused us good, or it has caused us more harm. And in that sense, whether ethics is objective or subjective. The popular notion, of course, very often comes to be that, well, ethics is subjective and to each his own, to each his or her own. Now, whether this holds, that if this is the case, then there is nothing objective about ethics, and everything seems to be subjective. So, it is a luxury of the aristocratic class to reflect on life and to think of what matters and what does not matter, right, and have goods which have reflections on morality which are subjective and therefore just a matter of pleasant conversation rather than anything necessary about it, right. So, what makes values possible? And that is a very foundational question that we come across. Now, the author raises these questions for us to answer them, but she also gives it an answer. Like any good philosophical treatise, it has an opening foundational questions to it, but then after that it starts answering those questions, arguing for a position that it takes. So, what makes values possible? Morality, is there anything? Can we have rationality or irrationality ascribed to the domain of morality? Can we look at it as irrational? Because if we look at it as irrational, well, there is nothing much to do about it. It seems to be one's own whims and fancies, and therefore, there is no argument about it, there is no implementation about it. Clearly, the author is arguing against that. The source of morality, where does morality come from? The source of, whether it comes from whims, from revelations, from metaphysics, from society, survival, or mortality, right? Where does this notion of morality come from? So, now before she starts answering the question, let us look at the big picture that she is trying to paint, which you should have in mind before you read the text for the first time. The author is arguing for a capitalist world order, and she justifies the capitalist world order as something that is championing freedom. And by championing freedom, it becomes a morally just world order, and in a capitalist world order, people are able to flourish because they have their freedoms expressed, they have lesser limitations by from others. Now, in the same breath, does that mean that if we have lesser limitation by others, is this license that anyone can do what they want to do? No, that is not what she is arguing for. She is in fact conceptualizing that what is it to be selfish? What is it? Selfish is a word that that bears quite a negative connotation, and selflessness is something that is eulogized. And please remember that whenever you read a text or an author, you have to locate them in the background that they come from. So, here Ayn Rand is protesting against the altruistic grain ingrained in the notion of Christianity, the popular religion of then and there at that time, where sacrifice and altruistic meaning was greatly appreciated, and selfishness was something looked upon as wicked, evil, and quite a deplorable way of living life. And this is true even today, that selflessness carries an aura of moral superiority over selfishness, which almost is seen as something which is condemnable. But here Ayn Rand turns the table, reconceptualizes the term, that what is it that makes selfishness so bad, and is selfishness so bad at all? So, first her verdict, she starts with, well, selfishness is nothing, there is nothing wrong with selfishness. And then what does she mean by selfishness? Selfishness is what she, as we would see later, calls rational selfishness. Selfishness, not that you get something at somebody else's cost, not a dog eat dog world, but a world in which where you are able to focus on your own goals. Now, look at it, how you can Ayn Rand has been a wildly popular author, where and people have been at the level of followers. They have built their own institute where it is advocated philosophy not just in academic circles, but to popularize Ayn Rand's way of thinking as the right way of living, right. So, when philosophy very often matures into ideology, it is powered by its own ideas, and there is a institutional built to promote and promulgate these ideas, not just as an thought provoking or amusement or entertainment or intellectual gymnastic, rather as a way of changing lives. There have been philosophers who have been presidents, both in Professor Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan is one example, and of course the North America also had John Hosper's philosopher who fought for presidentship on his idealistic grounds, of course did not win the election, but fought there. So there are philosophies and philosophers which touch the world out there. So once one is very convinced and clear about one's philosophy, one goes ahead and does that. One of the vehicles or one of the ways of doing this is literature. Movie makers are philosophers in a sense, especially people, significant movies that are made, movies that can alter the way we look at the world, can question the way we look at the world, are examples of philosophers or philosophies finding expression in stories, right. If you even look at the notion of our epics or epics in any civilizations, epics are generally stories, but these stories are not stories for entertainment or amusement only. These are stories which carry within them a philosophy that is promoting, and when they are couched in the form of stories and literature, they connect to more people, they go across civilizations, they also go across time. So literature has been a very powerful vehicle of philosophy, of ideas, of theories. So just as say Upanishads are the excerpts or the extracts of abstract philosophical thinking, the Puranas in the Indian tradition are fleshed out stories which gives content to these abstract philosophical treatises, which may not be appealing or comprehensible when seen independently of a story or a literature framework. So when we look at the history, or when we look at stories, or especially stories that have moved, if you look at Panchatantra, Jatakas, all these are stories which embody a certain philosophy of living, a certain moral value, and that value is comes across from the way the story is being told. So literature has a very strong connection with philosophy, and philosophy uses literature, or literature uses philosophy as the power to express itself. This particular text is an example of exactly that. So here the author is talking about is conceptualizing the term egoism. This is being reconceptualized, right? And what does that mean? That means that, well, how do we re-understand egoism? How do we re-understand what is selfish and whether there is something wrong with being selfish or not? Now coming back to the text, well, let us say a very pessimistic view of morality and ethics remained, especially in her times, when they looked as ethics either as a license to abuse, which caused more harm than benefit, what she talks about in the first point, and then to do away with that, perhaps the reaction has been to push ethics as a subjective matter, to each his own as or her own, as I mentioned, and therefore it just becomes an pleasant conversation or an intellectual gymnastic activity at the most, not something which is divorced from the real world and reality that we exhibit. Now, given this pessimistic background of ethics, now the author turns around and looks at what makes values possible. Well, what makes values possible is a very crucial question, and how one answers that question will determine what one holds as going to, or how one builds one's worldview or system that one inhabits. Well, we will come to the question and how she answers the question. Now, this text is a treatise, it is an argument that an author gives. So, she has answered these questions, these are fundamental questions, and any philosophical claim has to answer these questions. Now, she answers it in one way, a way that has been influential, and if I may say, has also been the dominant, or at least the sought after world order of the current day also, right. So, most societies are now either capitalist societies or trying to be capitalist societies, or many of them are trying to be. It's a venerable socio-economic order, and it was not so earlier, right. So, of course, there are pockets and there are various places where there can be differences, but this is a step in the direction of popularizing capitalism as a world economic order, right. So, now is there anything rational or irrational about it? That is the question. Now, let us come back to this question that she starts with. Well, what are the sources of morality? Whims as if, well, a saint who has whims, or once just feels that, well, if this is right, that makes it right. Very often this whim can be talked as emotivism as a moral theory, and not exactly a theory, again as a moral standpoint, which is really not a moral standpoint. It is also known as the boo-hurrah theory, well, where emotivists hold that, well, there is no such thing as morally right or wrong, anything towards which we feel happy, so that is a hurrah, we call it good, and anything to which we do not like or we have an emotional negative reaction, we call it bad. That is the simple way of it. So, this depends nothing, and there is nothing intrinsic about good and bad, it is just our emotional reactions to it. So, this is what when we talk about whims as the source of morality, and very often we have seen whims as the source of morality. Revelation, when we talk about revelation, we look at religious revelation, that we look at saints which claim that they have a connection to another world order, and from where they are revealed and they give a conversation, or they give a diktat, and that becomes the source of morality. Metaphysics, well, metaphysical theories sometimes are seen as a physicalism as a metaphysical theory would look at physical on a simplification, on a simplistic outlook, holding a physicalist theory and then looking at physical welfare as the sense of welfare. So, physicalism or naturalism, that looking at the domain of good and bad in the natural world framework. So, something, happiness is something which is equated to good. So, anything that promotes happiness becomes good, and therefore, anything that reduces happiness becomes bad. So, an example of naturalistic metaphysical position, typically what we can find in utilitarians, becomes an example of how a moral standpoint is based on metaphysics. Society very often becomes tradition, or when there is convention. So, whatever has been the convention that has been carried out in society, that becomes the moral order of the to be followed. Then there is, of course, survival ethics, and survival ethics is typically, if you would say, many modern day TV games that I see remind me of survival ethics, where survival becomes the benchmark to decide something that is right or wrong. So, if a certain say, I am not too familiar with the TV games, but say something well, okay, if I am not too familiar, I shouldn't perhaps venture into that, but games which look at survival, that the survivor as the winner, and of course, the theory of evolution, which holds that any practices that promotes a species survival becomes the right practice, and any practice that lessens the chances of a species or an individual survival, that becomes something bad. So, good and bad depending on what promotes survival and what does not promote survival, right. Now, the author here talks about one fundamental point, which is mortality, right, and here comes to this particular question, that indestructibility and mortality. Starts by leaving us with a question that, well, if you were immortal, if you were indestructible, how would your moral framework vary? Imagine if you wouldn't, you were indestructible, you won't perish, you won't have the fear of death, or you won't have the possibility of death, you were immortal and indestructible. How would your moral framework change? Pause for a moment and think over it. This is a typical example of how one uses thought experiments, right. These are called thought experiments. Thought experiments to reveal our position to ourselves. So, philosophers are famous or even notorious to use a lot of thought experiments. The critique of which is that, well, these are so far from reality, how does it matter? Say, for example, you may have heard of the trolley problem, that if you have the decision to switch a trolley between two alternative tracks with 3 people tied on one and 7 people tied on another, what would you decide? So, how many of us ever face that problem in life? And thankfully we don't. But so what's the point of talking it? This is the critical or the skeptical aspect of thought experiment. But the aim of thought experiment is not to prepare for a likely circumstance that may emerge in line with the proposed thought experiment, but it is to unearth one's own position, that whether say in the trolley example, whether we value number of lives over when we have to make a choice. Does number matter? Does quality matter? Does not taking a decision or not taking responsibility matter? So, now coming to this thought experiment that Ayn Rand proposes, is that if we were indestructible, if we were immortal, how would our moral framework change? So, if we were, let us imagine what would happen if we were indestructible. So, we would really not be, and if we were immortal, we were we would always be in a, we would be not be in a rush for anything. We would not be afraid of losing. We would not be afraid of perishing. We would not be afraid of going about and losing our lives. We would not be afraid of so many things, and thereby I see that, or the author claims that our mortality is very crucial to our morality. So, whenever we have we are mortal, the domain of morality comes into being, right? So, mortality and morality are crucially related. Self-destruction as self-contradictory, contrast with freedom superseding survival. So, when we look at self-destruction, can we look at it as self-contradictory? And so, maybe we typically talk of the case of suicides or self-harms. Is destroying oneself self-contradictory? Or when one destroys oneself for a superior cause, does that become valid? Take a moment to think over it. So, take a moment to pause about how life or our mortality is connected or generates our morality. The author answers that, well, morality is generated by our mortality. So, we will stop for now and take this further in the next lecture. Thank you.